Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another book review for the RTC book club. So if you guys don't know, if you haven't been following along, I have been doing a year-long book club challenge thing, personal challenge, not like an actual challenge, where I'm going through a bunch of Greek retellings, and last month, or for the month of June, we read the book Ariadne together, and it's an open book club, so you guys are welcome to join at any time. You can hop in, you can hop out, and you can do whatever you want. You just gotta send me a message on Instagram, join the group chat, we chat about it, we talk about it, but I like to review the book before I jump into the group chat. So, here we are, doing a review of words are really hard. Doing a review on Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. And if you are not interested in the review, but interested in what next month's book will be, it will in fact be Medusa by Jessie Burton. That's what we're reading next month. So I'm excited for that. And like I said, you can read the book. You can join the chat for just 1 month. You can join for the rest of the year if you want to join the little book club and read along with the rest of us. It's been really fun so far, and I'm really enjoying it. Right now, we're going to get into Ariadne, and I will let you guys know when I drop major spoilers so you can jump out if you don't want the book to be spoiled for you, if you haven't read it yet. I don't know how to slowly ease my way into this review, so I'm just gonna say it right off the top, you guys. I didn't like this book. And I really wanted to, and I thought I was going to. I liked the previous book that I read by the same author. We did Atalanta earlier in the year, and I liked that book a lot, but for the whatever reason, this book was not it. It was not giving what I wanted, what I hoped for, what I expected, what I anticipated. None of those things, none of those little categories were checked off at any point in this book, and that was so disappointing. And I've just never been so let down by a book before. I've read some stinkers, but this one just really depressed me with how much I didn't like it. So in the arbitrary rating scale, I would give it 4 potatoes. Just 4 regular out-of-the-ground potatoes. Because that's how I felt. The writing is fine, the story structure is okay, but I just had such a hard time connecting with the characters and their motivations, and then the way that the story is flipped apart. Because I'm gonna let you guys know, Ariadne is not actually the star of her own book. The book is split between the perspective of her and her sister Phaedra, and I understand why. And I'll get more into why I think that's the choice that was made here. But also, it's not my favorite choice because her name is on the cover. So she should be the main player in the story, and she's not. And by about halfway through, she becomes a side character in her own story. And that's just so sad and disappointing. And I wish I had more things I could say positive about it. But I really just didn't like it. It just didn't connect. And it's not even I had a super visceral reaction to the story outside of the fact that I feel this missed the mark in the category of these feminist quote-unquote retellings of Greek mythology, of Greek myths, because that's what we've been reading mostly are these feminist retellings of Greek myths, and this wasn't very feminist. And I don't know if it's by design or not. It just rang really hollow as far as that goes. And I think that is becoming sort of a running theme along with a lot of these other retellings, is that they're not really feminist in their retelling. They're just sort of retelling or retreading the same steps of the original myths without actually adding anything to develop it into a feminist narrative, or to even enhance the story to a point where you're okay, well, this was worth going through it. Because I don't feel like this book in particular was worth going through it. And that makes me sad, because I would love to recommend these books to you guys and be every book was great. And especially coming off of the high that I had for last month's book, I was hoping to keep that roller coaster going, and it just wasn't, which is okay. Not every book is going to be good, but this one was just especially disappointing to me in how much it didn't work for me. So that's all I'm going to say. That's not spoiler free. So if you don't want to be spoiled, disappear into the ether. Off you go. We'll see you next month for Medusa by Jessie Burton, which hopefully will be a better experience. This one was recommended to me, so I think it's going to be a better experience. But now we're in spoiler territory. So my major issue with this story, and like I said, just 2 seconds ago, is that it's not really a feminist retelling, because there's no point in this where Ariadne devised any sort of convention, has any sort of thought outside of the ones that are already laid out before her. She doesn't really push against any of her roles in the society. She just accepts everything that happens to her every time it happens to her. And it kind of got to the point where I was happy for Phaedra's chapters, her sister's chapters, because Phaedra had more of a personality to me. She had more of that, like, rage against the machine I was hoping for in a feminist retelling, where she wasn't happy with her defined roles and she wasn't happy with the way things were, the status quo. But unfortunately, she was bound to them. She had to live in this society. But she found ways to make it so that she could sort of reclaim some agency and some control over her life and make herself pivotal in her role as a woman, as a queen, to the point where, you know, she managed to have some sort of agency, some sort of weight to her presence, whereas it just felt like Ariadne took a back seat to the entirety of her life, and then by the time she decided to take some sort of control of the reins, it was too little too late. It just didn't pay off for her. Now, granted, there's a point in the story, especially if you're familiar with the myth of Phaedra, where she goes from being, like, a character I enjoyed reading to a character who goes straight into Delulu City, but I already knew her myth going in, so I expected that turn to happen at some point, and she absolutely does go into full Delulu, and it's a crazy thing that could have just been solved by communication, but you know how, like, myths, they wouldn't happen if people communicated, so that's not present in there at all. But, like, I think also, too, the thing that made this really disappointing is the fact that Ariadne is kind of a side character in her own story. Because the small bit of, like, freedom she grasps for is to get away from this arranged marriage that her father has set up for her by following Theseus and helping him defeat the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Sorry, words are really hard today, guys. I'm struggling. But she doesn't actually go into the labyrinth outside of dropping his club into the doorway so he can use it to kill the Minotaur, which was just so anticlimactic and so disappointing, because I was so excited to see, like, chapters of her helping him navigate the labyrinth and them developing the relationships and making more sense as to why she would follow this man all the way across the sea and expect, you know, things to happen. But it all develops like a Disney movie. It literally happens overnight, which, like, granted, in the mythology, it also happens overnight as well. You know, like, they have, like, a day to develop their relationship, so I understand that the novel's going to follow the same thing, but, like, we're walking back, okay? So, she's a princess. Her brother is the Minotaur, and she manages to get not only a key to Theseus' cell, because Theseus arrives with other tributes to the labyrinth, but she also manages to get a tool to help navigate the labyrinth from the inventor Daedalus, who makes a small brief appearance, and, you know, we don't get a lot out of that, but I also would have enjoyed seeing more from Daedalus and Icarus. More of a presence from them. It's so weird to me, the pacing in this story, because it sort of ramps up pretty quickly to get to, like, the action-y part of the labyrinth, and then all that happens off the page. You don't see what happens because she doesn't participate in it. And I was expecting her to go into the labyrinth and help him navigate through, and then take, like, you know, a little sidestep so that, you know, Theseus can go kill her brother, which she didn't want him to, but, you know, she knew it was inevitable and had to happen. And then them escaping together using the ball of yarn that she gets from Daedalus, the tool that she was given in order to navigate the labyrinth. But no, she just gives that to Theseus, and she drops off his weapon, and she just stands outside and waits for him to show up on the beach so that they can escape together. And it was just so disappointing, because something that should have been, like, you know, character development, an action piece, a climactic moment, wasn't there. It was just yada 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 and on to the next thing. And that's how this story felt to me a lot of the time, is that it was just like, and then yada yada yada, here we are. And that's just such a weird bit of pacing, a weird bit of writing, that made it really hard for me to enjoy the story, because the things that I was interested in, I didn't get to see. That didn't happen. It was just sort of stated, as opposed to being like, well, let me show you through the narrative. That didn't happen whatsoever. And not whatsoever. It didn't happen in the way that I wanted it to, or when I thought it was going to. But, you know, there were, of course, narrative moments, and the story did flow along. And the pacing of the story is fine. Like, I was okay with the pace of the book. But, like, just like the meat wasn't there. It was all potatoes, which is why it got 4 potatoes. And it was so strange to me. And then she ends up in this situation where she's waiting for Theseus on the beach, and she knows that her sister is also supposed to be there. Or she's not waiting for Theseus on the beach, I'm sorry. She goes with Theseus to the beach. They're on the opposite shore from the one that he told her sister to go to. And she doesn't put her foot down or demand that her sister get there. She doesn't get, like, whisked away by him. He just sort of gaslights her into leaving, and she goes along with it. And then they get to the island of Naxos, and he tells her, like, they're gonna get married, that's the whole goal, and then gaslights her into sleeping with him that night. And she just kind of goes along with everything, which was so frustrating. She's just like, well, this is the situation I'm in, so I have to just continue letting things happen. And she gets left behind by Theseus on the island of Naxos the next day. He takes off without her, and then she just accepts that she's gonna have to die on this island, and she's probably gonna starve to death and die. And then I was like, okay, dramatic, but I get it. Like, I would probably also go through that phase. Like, you have to go through all the phases of grief, right? And those kind of things. But also, like, I mean, I'm not, like, a super, like, man versus wilderness person, you guys. I don't exist in the outdoors, so I probably would really struggle and die, but I would try to survive. I'd try to build a raft and get the fuck off the island or something, right? But she's just like, no, I'm just gonna be depressed for a few days and slowly starve and dehydrate. And then she discovers a spring of fresh water, and she discovers wine, and she discovers grapes, so she has food and, like, stuff to eat and drink. And she's just like, well, I'm just gonna die here. And she's okay accepting that, to the point where she is so accepting of her inevitable death that she destroys those things in a rage because she's so upset, which I get, kind of expressing that she's not regulating her emotions because of all the traumatic things that she's gone through, having to accept the death of her brother, and then being abandoned by a guy that she just met and slept with, and promised he was going to marry her, but he ends up abandoning her to die on an island. I get that she was going through this roller coaster of emotions, and I think that's what the author was trying to convey, was that, she has all these feelings and she's not handling them well, so she's lashing out even at the things that could be her salvation. And she doesn't, like, come to her senses until she realizes that she doesn't have to die on the island when Dionysus shows up. And, like, I thought at the beginning, like, her relationship with Dionysus was going to develop in an interesting way, but it was just really standard and straightforward, and there wasn't really a lot of interest to it. Dionysus's depiction in the beginning of the book was really nice, and I was like, okay, like, I see how you could become attracted to this man and how she would fall in love with a god and those sort of things. And they settle down to have a quiet life on the island, and she does ask him, because Dionysus leaves the island and comes back, so he ventures off the island to go do his godly business and whatever he does in his travels, and comes back and then tells her what he saw. And she does ask about her sister finally, and he gives her this, like, really vague prophecy about her marrying a king and being fine, and that she's one day gonna show up on the shores and she'll see her sister again. And she just accepts that, and she's just like, all right, because this is, like, her whole role in the story, is to just accept the information she's being given at face value with no further questioning. And it was so irritating. So irritating, because, like, I don't have siblings, so I only have to imagine what it's like to have a sibling. But if I got abandoned on an island by some dude that I just met, like, and I had run away with, and I knew that my sister had been left behind to deal with the aftermath of all of my actions, and my new boyfriend is like, oh yeah, your sister's gonna marry well, but one day she'll come back to visit you at some unspecified time in the future, I'd be like, okay, well, why don't we just fucking go visit her together? You're a god. Like, literally, take me off this island. I need to see my sister. There has to be some way for me to get back to her, whatever country she's fucking in now. Like, I need to get there. But, like, Dionysus is being deliberately vague because Phaedra doesn't know that Theseus intentionally misdirected her to the wrong part of the island so he could leave her behind. She doesn't know that he left her sister behind to die. She thinks that her sister died on that island from, like, a snake bite, and that Theseus is, like, woeful about it and, did all the proper funeral rites. And so she has to repair the relationship between Athens and her country, whose name I forgot, Crete. And so she ends up being, like, betrothed in an arranged marriage to Theseus. Granted, she's several years younger, so she has to wait until she grows up and hits maturity before they can actually get married. But she gets shipped out immediately to go live with him until she's old enough to marry, which is gross, but that's how they did things. But underneath this entire time, she's underneath the impression her sister is dead. And she kind of gets the feeling that Theseus is lying, and she kind of questions him a little bit about it. But eventually she lets up and just accepts that her sister is dead, and there's some weird bit to the story that, like, he's not telling her. But, you know, she's not as go along to get along as Ariadne is. She does pester the hell out of him because she knows that he's not being truthful. She just doesn't know in what way he's not being truthful. But, like, poor Phaedra is sitting over here marrying the man that left her sister to die on an island, and trying to sort of find her place in this new world that she has to live in, this new reality, underneath the impression her sister is dead, so she's not actively trying to look for her. Meanwhile, Ariadne knows her sister is alive, and is just like, I'll wait until she shows up then, that's fine. And I'm like, please, be fucking for real, for real. I would have given Dionysus 0 peace until I got confirmation on my sister with my eyeballs visually, but yet she doesn't press the issue, and I'm like, okay, like, maybe she doesn't want to anger Dionysus because he's a god, but Dionysus is not keeping her prisoner on this island, you guys. He's not making her stay there. She's choosing to stay there and live this life because she believes that she should be punished for everything that happened, for the death of her brother, the shaming of her family, all these things, because she was the one who helped Theseus do this in the first place, which, like, there is a little bit of guilt and, like, that sort of thing. Like, you can hold on to that, but, like, this girl will punish herself forever for one action, and that's crazy to me. Sorry, there was a weird cut there. I heard people coming up the stairs, and I had to be really quiet so that when they knocked on my door, they didn't think I was home. I don't know who the fuck it was. Nobody comes to my house. That's so weird. But we're back. I didn't answer the door, don't worry. And here we go. So, the other thing that sort of drove me crazy about this is just how much of a backseat she takes to everything in the entirety of the story. You guys, I'm not kidding, because at some point she gets married to Dionysus, they start settling down, having a family, and while they're living on the island, more of Dionysus's worshippers, they're called Maenads, start showing up to the island, and they're like independent women who are freeing themselves, running away from whatever situation they're in, moving to the island, and then joining them to live this quiet, like, farming life on this island, and she's, like, content with this quiet, happy life, which is fine, okay? There's nothing wrong with being content with your quiet, happy life. But, like, what bugged me about this is that these women are fleeing similar situations, like, arranged marriages, abusive husbands or abusive family members, like, just fleeing from the gender role that has already been prescribed to them in the same way that she did. She rejected having to get into this arranged marriage with a much older man who only wanted her because she was pretty, and, you know, she ended up in this whole different situation, this whole different lifestyle than she thought she was going to be in because she rejected this one man. So these other women show up and they're doing the same thing. They're rejecting these roles put on them by the patriarchy at the time. And they show up and they just join the society that Dionysus is, like, building on this island. And there's not a lot with her, like, interacting with these other women who are there with her, which drove me crazy because, like, I get that she's, like, sort of accepting that this is her fate, this is what she thinks is she's due because she feels so guilty about everything. She's the only person punishing herself in the story, which is incredible because she's not at fault to start with. Like, yeah, granted, she is responsible for her brother dying because she set up Theseus to kill him, but her brother was a monster, and unfortunately was not a redeemable monster, because in the beginning of the story, she does try to redeem him and help him become, like, a chill kid, and it just doesn't work. He's more monster than man, so, like, she can't. But she feels bad about it, and I get it, because she tried really hard to love her brother, and that, like, thing I understand. But her father was using her brother actively as a weapon to punish other nations, and force them to sacrifice their children every year. So, like, girl, you had to do something. So she does, but she's the only person punishing herself for these actions, and I don't think she's responsible for any of them. I don't think she's at fault for any of them. I mean, she's responsible, not at fault. But, like, these women are showing up to the island and she doesn't interact with them in any meaningful way. She doesn't try to help them or, like, get to learn their stories or stuff like that. She's just like, yeah, they're here. As a matter of fact, not an important thing. And it gets to the point where, like, she used to join Dionysus in his, like, rituals with the Maenads, and then when they started having kids, she steps back and she's like, oh, I'm not really interested in that. I'm just interested in being a mom and living on this farm. And that's all she does, and that's her whole role for the rest of the fucking, like, book, is her being a mom, living on this farm, asking no fucking questions. And by the time she starts asking questions, it's too goddamn late. Okay, so because eventually, it gets to the point where she realizes that there is some blood involved in these rituals with Dionysus, and that starts to bother her, and it takes her forever to take the initiative to, like, figure out what's going on. And does she turn to her godly husband and go, like, hey, bro, what is this about? Like, why blood? No, she decides to sneak over there and observe the ritual themselves. Turns out that his, like, happiness, fertility, girl group empowerment ritual has now turned into, like, a blood death cult, which is true for the lore of Dionysus. He was said to have powers over resurrection because he was twice born, and it becomes one of those things where he demonstrates this ability by having the Maenads rip apart a goat with their bare hands, and then he resurrects it and it comes back to life. And he's sort of building this cult of worship around the fact that he is now a god of death and resurrection, and building up his following that way. And she's like, oh, that's upsetting. Does she ask him about it? No. She waits. She continues to wait. And all of this, like, thing is happening. All this, like, craziness, his escalation, the distance growing between her and her husband, this chasm of a lack of communication, is all because he started out in the beginning of the relationship being like, mortals die. I'm okay with that. I can accept that, even though I'm a god and I'll live forever. But then, because he's so in love with her, he starts to get, like, upset at the idea that she's going to die. And decides to sort of delve into this to increase his worship, increase his ability to sort of deal with his inability to accept that his wife is going to one day die and leave him. And does he communicate that? No, because he's a god and also a dude, and communicating your feelings is not that easy, especially in this type of society. But when they finally talk about it, it's too late. Like, they're way too far into the game. They've already built up all that resentment between each other. The value between them is so huge, and she tries to, like, reconnect and build the relationship back together, but it doesn't matter. And, like, it's too late. Like, he's too far lost in the sauce of his, like, cult of worship, and she's too far into, like, the I've dug my feet into the ground, I will be nothing but a boy mom my entire life, I'm not interested in any of this. And then her story ends tragically because he decides to be a dick to Perseus and dig his heels in, drives the entire city that Perseus is the king of mad, and she gets caught in the crossfire of Medusa's head, the head of Medusa, because he still keeps it, like, with the shield. So she gets exposed to the head of Medusa, becomes a statue, and he tosses her into the stars so she can fuck off forever and be a star, which is the most disappointing ending ever, especially because in the mythology, he gets godhood for her too, and she becomes his immortal wife, and they live together happily forever. So that's where I thought the book was going, but instead the interpretation of this was that she becomes a star and gets to live as a star forever, by herself with her own thoughts for fucking eternity, which sounds like hell to me, but she was apparently okay with it because all Ariadne does is go along to get along. And that's the entirety of her story, is basically just playing a back seat to everything else that's happening to her, letting these things happen to her, and then not acting in time to either prevent these things or work them out before they become catastrophic. And, like, it's just so lackluster of a story for a character that, like, you know, granted, doesn't do a lot in her own mythology outside of help Theseus get into the mythology and then get left on an island and then end up marrying Dionysus and living forever. But after getting such an impassioned depiction of her as Dionysus's immortal wife in Herc, I was like, what the fuck is this? There's such a good characterization of her in that novel in the few chapters that we got involving her, and in this book I was like, what is this? And it was so disappointing, and I kind of wish I had asked maybe a more probing question about the plot of this book to my friend who had read it before, because the reason I wanted to do Ariadne was because I enjoyed her depiction in her so much that I was like, well, of course, let's get more of this. And then it was less of that. It was such a sad, disappointing moment. And you might be like, okay, well, what happened to Phaedra this whole time? And essentially what happens is Phaedra grows up, she marries Theseus, and Theseus starts to get like pissy cranky because he's stuck being a king, God forbid, and wants to go on adventures again. And she uses her brain to manipulate him into leaving to go on adventures again, because she's like, oh, you only did one thing? Don't you want a legacy of heroics to follow you, like Hercules that you're so in love with? And he's like, oh yeah, I actually do. So he decides to go off on adventures so she doesn't have to deal with her husband being around and being a dark presence like in her life constantly. She gets rid of this man and she's like, go fuck off out of here. But he does come back eventually, occasionally, and eventually she gets pregnant, and it's a really interesting experience because when she does finally give birth, unlike her sister, she doesn't just devolve or accept, not devolve, that's so pejorative. It's because I'm mad at the book, not at mothers. She doesn't just accept like her role as a mother. She actually retaliates against it. She actually resents being a mother. She doesn't enjoy the experience. She realizes once she gives birth that she does not want to be a mother. Motherhood is not for her. And she ends up having to do it another time after that, and she hates it. She absolutely hates it. So she starts to try to like come up with ways to avoid having to deal with her husband so she can avoid this scenario. And she manages to work her way into like the royal council, senate, whatever group of old men who make the laws and stuff for the city and take care of things while her husband is away. She manages to make her way in there by like sort of feigning ignorance and wanting to learn and just sort of, you know, join the little group and see what she can learn from these smart, wise men. And she uses her intelligence to manipulate these men into letting her join these sessions until she learns enough that she's able to start making input in her society, in her kingdom, and start influencing the decisions in the course of things. So she manages to wrest a little bit of control back of her life, of these men that are controlling her life. She manages to get some of that back by appealing to their nature and sort of playing them against themselves, which made her a vastly more interesting character to me, because she didn't just accept her fate and go, well, I'll just sit here and pop out children and do nothing to solve the story. And then eventually it gets revealed to her that her sister is actually alive and married to Dionysus. And she's like, what the fuck? And then Theseus has to backpedal his lie and be like, well, maybe it was an illusion. Maybe I didn't actually leave your sister to die. And she knows he's lying, and she's not like willing to accept it. And she eventually manages to work up the initiative and the ability to go see her sister on the island. You know, she's the queen of Athens, so she does use that position to go get on a boat and go find her sister, so they can be reunited. Part of this is for a selfish reason, though, because at the same time, her delulu starts to creep in because one of Theseus's bastard children that he got by raping an Amazon queen, like, the fuck, Theseus is the worst, this bastard illegitimate child shows up. It's a boy child, so it couldn't stay with the Amazonian women forever. So he comes to live with them. His name is Hippolytus. And he's like a really simple, really down-to-earth boy. He doesn't want to stay in the castle. He just wants to live out in the stables with his horse and like chill. He doesn't even want the throne. He has no interest in like taking anything away from his father. He just doesn't have a place to go. So he's out there and he's kind of nice to her a little bit, even though he's a little bit nervous to talk to her because he's not really used to like this position that he's in and having to deal with somebody's wife and things like that. So she sees this little crumb of niceness from this guy, this teenage boy, and decides that he must secretly be in love with her, because he tells her that he swore a vow to Artemis, to remain chaste forever and just live as a wild boy, hunting stuff and riding his horses for the rest of his days. And she decides that he must have sworn this vow because he's in love with someone he couldn't have, and then decides that that person is her, and that's where she devolves into the Lululand, and that's where I was like, oh, hate this too. But I knew where the story was going. I knew this was going to come up eventually. I didn't know how. I didn't expect her to lean into full delusion, but she does. And that's okay. I knew the outcome of her story, so I expected something like that to happen. But it was very disappointing to have a character that I thought was more engaging suddenly go absolutely cuckoo crazy. And she does. But she gets on this boat, she goes to see her sister, and then when she finally gets reunited with her sister, she brings up this forbidden romance that she wants to initiate. She wants to run away with Hippolytus, off into the sunset, because she's still fairly young, all things considering, and therefore, ergo, can make this work, even though it's clearly doomed from the start. And to her credit, Ariadne, as her sister, as a good sister, does tell her, she tells Phaedra, that's not gonna work. That's actually a stupid idea. Your plan is stupid and no good. And unfortunately, Phaedra takes that personally. So she goes home, and she's like, that's it, I don't even care that you're alive anymore. And she goes home, and then Ariadne, finally showing some agency in her own story, decides to go chase down her sister, because that's when she cares, when she realizes her sister is still living, even though she knew her sister was living the entire time. But now her sister's gonna make a stupid decision, so she wants to be there to support her, which is cool, you're her sister, I get it, come through, sister. But also, years went by, and you didn't think your sister was making a stupid decision one time? You needed her to make a stupid decision to get motivated enough to go see her? Crazy to me. So irritatingly crazy to me. But she goes, so she's present at the time where all this breaks down. Turns out, spoiler again, Hippolytus was not actually interested in Phaedra. He viewed her as a mother because she was in fact the wife of his father, and he rejects her, and he goes to ride his horses because that's all he cares about. He's a virtuous young man who really does want to remain chaste and just hang out with his horses. And she's so ashamed and embarrassed, and she knows, because Hippolytus is such a good kid, he's going to eventually tell his father that his wife made a pass at him. And instead of just getting back on a boat and going back home, she does the thing she does in the myth, which I knew was going to happen, but be for real, for real. She ends up hanging herself from a tree instead of having to deal with the shame, and then inadvertently frames Hippolytus because she wrote his name on a piece of paper because she was going to write a note out to explain everything, but then decides not to, so she stopped at just writing his name. So when Theseus finds his wife's body hanging from the tree, he finds the note that has Hippolytus' name on it and decides to go kill his son. So she dies, Hippolytus dies, and that's the end of Phaedra's story, and it's exactly what happens in the myth. So, I can't be mad about it, but I'm mad because she was the character I was the most invested in, because she had the most interesting, narration. She had the most interesting perspective, and she took agency of her own story. And I think that's what makes me so angry, is that Ariadne literally takes the backseat the entire time. And then all the parts of the story that I was oh, we could see how, her relationship with, Dionysus develops, what makes her so attracted to her, to him, and what makes her so attractive to him. Because the way that she's written, I don't see why he finds that appealing, outside of the fact that she just happens to be there. And, it was just, I don't know. It just skipped over. It was okay, now they're married. Okay, now it's been a couple years and they have kids. Okay, now, well, this is happening and this is whatever. And these, character moments where we could have built up these relationships get skipped by. So it just seems like she's a spectator to her life as opposed to an active participant, because she's just so willing to let everything go. And it was so frustrating to read. And I know that, people are like this, but I don't think they're this much like this. Eventually something's gotta give, and you gotta be hey, I have some more questions. Hey, what the actual fuck? And she never does that until it's too little too late, until her relationship starts to break down, and then you start to wonder why they're even together in the first place. And then, because of the way that this is written, it goes from Dionysus being sort of a charming, cool guy to absolutely hell-bent on achieving power and domination over his half-brother, Perseus. over everything else. Like, he's willing to take these great lengths to the point of, like, evilness. He delves right into evil territory. And I get that we're dealing with, you know, immortal beings and gods, and they don't have the same rationale. We can't expect the same morality to apply, or for them to act in the way that we would expect to be the most human. But he goes, like, right into villain category to the point where he's irredeemable as a person. And you're like, okay, well, why does she stay with someone so clearly irredeemable? But then she ends up dying. Doesn't matter. She's frozen in stone and gets fucked off into space. And that's the story. And I could not stand this book. It made me so angry. And, like, I kind of think about it. Jennifer Saint wrote Atalanta, and my biggest complaint about the characterization of Atalanta was that Atalanta was not a girl's girl. But I was willing to let that go because she kind of grows up in a situation where being a girl's girl isn't really the move. Because Artemis wasn't depicted as a girl's girl either. And I found it to be super irritating, but I was like, okay, like, that's a personal thing where I'm like, you need to ask him about his wife. You need to, like, protect these women around you because you're the strongest woman there. Like, you need to step up and say things and, like, speak out because you're not afraid to. And you don't have to worry about the backlash like other women do in this society, in this culture. But I was willing to let that go because Atalanta's entire characterization, her story arc, is being more focused on her achievements physically, like her athleticism, her ability to run, her hunter, like, tendencies, being an excellent hunter, that kind of thing, a warrior. Her focus isn't really on being one of the girls. But when I read this book, I was like, okay, you think Ariadne would care about these women showing up to her island a little bit more. You think she'd care about her sister a little bit more. You think she'd care about the other women around her because she knows that she's also a woman living in this society, and it's been unfair to her, so it's definitely being unfair to them. So there's something she can find, like, common ground in and sympathize and be empathetic with, but she doesn't. She just accepts things as they are and is like, all right, well, I'm happy with our quiet little life. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with being happy with your quiet little life, but, like, it's just so frustrating that she just accepts things as they are. The status quo is to not be questioned, and she doesn't get to develop those relationships with the other women. And it starts to make me feel like maybe, like, the author herself doesn't really like women that much, because the depiction of these women is not positive in any way. I don't leave with positive feelings of these women, even when their story should be relatively positive. Ariadne's story in the myth ends on a positive note. You know, she gets punished for her actions, she gets abandoned on an island, but turns out it works out for the best because she manages to upgrade and marry a god and become immortal. But in this story, I was just like, man, she doesn't care about anything except for her own, like, self-imposed punishment and guilt and just being a mom. That's her whole vibe, which is cool, but, like, not cool to read. You know, it doesn't add a lot to fiction, and it doesn't add anything to her story either. Like, I don't feel like this was a feminist retelling, and I don't feel like it enhanced the narrative of the existing mythology. In fact, I feel like it worked it backwards a little bit, and I'm a little bit concerned because it seems to be like that's the trend. Either it's not a feminist retelling and it's just kind of a retelling where nothing, like, new or inventive is added, nothing is used to enhance the narrative in a way that could be viewed through a feminist lens. There's no feminist perspective. It's just, well, we're telling the story from a woman's perspective, therefore ergo feminist, and that's not necessarily the case. I don't know. Like, I could argue that the book that we read last month, Herc, actually was a feminist retelling, because it did take place not only from the perspective of the women, but also the men he encountered. But in the chapters with the women, you really did get their perspectives on this man in a way that was kind of like, hey, this guy might be cool and all, but he's not everything you think. Here's how he treated me, or here's how we handled it. And in some cases it was for the best, in some cases it was for the worst, and it was just more of a fair look, a fair lens, a balanced lens. I wouldn't necessarily say fair, but a balanced lens of viewing this mythological character through the lens of feminism. You got both sides, and you were able to see in the way that the story was changed or enhanced to be more of a feminist telling of their encounter. Even the actions that Hercules took in the book got viewed by the women and their responses were there. I don't know. I just didn't like this book, and that's, I guess, everything I have to say about it. Let me know what you guys think. If you've read this book, did you feel the same way? Do you feel differently? I would love to hear your perspectives on it. If you have read it and want to, continue the conversation, definitely hop over to Instagram, send me a message there, and I'll add you to the book chat, the book club chat, and we can get everybody's perspectives on it. I'm really interested to chat this book up in book club this month, because I don't know if I'm the only person who feels like this, and I'm just being salty and bitter about it, or if other people also felt this way when reading this book. But I'd be really interested to know. And like I said, just to recap, for next month we'll be reading Medusa by Jessie Burton, and somebody recommended this book specifically to me, so I'm really hoping that it doesn't hurt my heart the way that Ariadne did. But that's gonna be it for me, guys. If you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate your faces, and I'll catch you guys all in the next one. Until then, happy crafting. Bye.